This episode of Color Code is brought to you by our friends over at Mighty Boards, but more on them later on. That was pretty slick, eh? Today, we're going to talk about the paint color called White Pepper by Behr Paint. Like a lot of our paint reviews, this one was requested by one of you, so thank you so much for your continued engagement. Welcome, or welcome back, to Color Code, a series all about cracking the code on paint colors. White Pepper's color code is PPU24-13, and today we're going to talk about the color itself, but also give you some color pairing options so you can incorporate it into your home as well. This episode focuses mainly on using it inside your home, but if you're looking for some exterior color options, I'll leave one of our videos all about exterior colors in the cards up top. So white pepper is a color that I like to call an off-white. It's not quite bright enough to be deemed as a pure white. In fact, I feel there are very few colors in paint that would get that distinction. You're always going to have some sort of undertones peeking through, and you'll also have colors that vary in their levels of depth. We can figure out how dark white pepper is by looking at its light reflectance value, which you can find on the Behr Paint website. You can see right over here that it's 78, which means it reflects 78% of the visible light that hits it. You can almost call this a lightness score, if you will. The higher it is, the lighter the paint will appear. And this applies to any paint color. Because it's slightly under that 80-point threshold that I usually apply to off-white paint colors. The thing is, however, if you see it in a very bright environment, it may look off-white, or even in some cases, just plain old white. But that's only if you have a ton of light hitting it. It also has a noticeable coloration to it compared to something a little more stark or crisp. It does have some noticeable warmth to it, almost grayish leaning, but you don't get a ton of yellowy beige coming through. It's almost closer to a very light brown or taupe that's been tinted with a bunch of white. Overall, I see it as a pretty passive color that shouldn't give you too many problems. In fact, I see it as a great candidate for a default main color that you can use in many areas of your home without much issue. And not many colors get that distinction. The only way to know for sure that it's the right color for you, however, is to test the color out before you buy your paint. As always, our favorite way to test paint colors is to use a Mighty board, which are large paintable boards that are flexible and do not warp or bend in the process. Instead of using those tiny little paint swatches you get from the paint store, by painting one of these guys, a Mighty board, you get a much larger swatch to work with. And that's so important with colors like white pepper, because you really want to make sure you're seeing those subtle nuances on a much larger surface. Mighty boards are also great if you wish to test the same color in multiple areas because of how moldable they are. It's an excellent product, and a big thanks to Mighty Boards for helping us out with today's video. I'll leave their information down below if you want to pick some up for yourself. Let's get into one of my favorite parts of color code, the pairings, aka my little creative concoctions that I've put together. So now that we know about white pepper, let me give you some color pairings that I found for it that create this really nice little color palette that you can use today if you really wanted to. If you're new to color code, we have a light pairing, a medium one, and a dark one, as well as an off-white at the end that you can use for your trim or your baseboards. Because white pepper is a pretty light color to begin with, the light color pairing I went with has a very similar level of depth with a 75 LRV, so just a bit darker, but very different undertone-wise. It's called Etched Glass, and if you looked at it on its own, it may appear gray, but when you put it next to white pepper, you can really see how much cooler it is with its clear blue undertone. There's also a bit of red in there, which does give it an icy periwinkle purple feeling to it. And like I said, the color really comes to life when paired with something like white pepper with that warmth. It doesn't have to have a ton of warmth, but you can really see the warm and cool complementing one another. I could definitely see the two working in the same space for a really dynamic yet still subtle back and forth, because how dynamic can two light neutrals be, really? I mean, come on, guys. Can I still say guys? You could also have white pepper as a hallway color, and then etched glass in bedrooms and bathrooms to visually differentiate certain spaces. For the second color pairing, which is the midtone, I went with Dusty Lilac, which is even more purple than Etched Glass. It has a 60 LRV, which is a pretty easy level of depth to work with. Sometimes I take my mid-tone color pairings a bit darker, but I wanted to keep everything feeling light and airy, so far at least. Wait till the next color. This color is a different sort of purple. Instead of a blue-leaning periwinkle, this has a clear red undertone, which gives it a mauve coloration. I don't know why, but whenever I see colors like this, I'm always reminded of a wild berry smoothie or a blueberry yogurt that doesn't actually end up looking all that blue, but closer to something like this. I'm a foodie. Actually, I'm just hungry. So now I'm going to introduce the third color pairing, which is our dark color. And yes, it's quite a bit darker than anything else we've talked about thus far, and that's by design. I'm very clever here. I wanted a very clear, deep accent to pop off everything else, and what's great is this doesn't even need to be manifested as a paint color. I'll just get to it. It's called Cracked Pepper, which essentially is just a charcoal gray, which you can use in many different ways throughout your home. This color in particular is very balanced undertone-wise. It doesn't really have a strong pull in any direction. It doesn't feel overly green or brown or purple or blue like some other off blacks can feel like. Cracked pepper just really feels like a deep, dark gray, but that usually means it'll appear a tad cooler in practical use. That's largely due to interior lighting favoring the cool side of things, especially north-facing light or LED light that is more higher in the Kelvin ratings. I wouldn't really worry too much about the undertones here because, as I mentioned before, they're extremely passive and docile. They're not going to jump out and ruin your whole color palette. I could see this color looking awesome in a powder room, on the walls, trim, and even ceiling. You should never be afraid to paint your powder room black or cracked pepper. For my trim and baseboard color for this palette, or anything you wanted to use white paint on, I'm going with Frost, mainly because of its 87 LRV, but also its really stark crispness that perhaps leans a tad cooler than other whites, but really coincides with the rest of the palette. Even white pepper being a bit warmer isn't overly so, and that's what makes it such a great fit with Frost on the baseboards. For another episode, click here where we crack the code on another color.